So, take a look at your car. Ever really thought about where it comes from? I don't just mean the assembly plant. I'm talking about where every single little piece, every nut, bolt, and microchip actually started its life. Because that story, well, it's way more complicated and honestly, way more important than most of us realize. You see, for something like 50 years, the global economy has been running on a really simple rule: make things wherever it's cheapest. Period. The whole system was built to chase the lowest possible cost. But that system, it's been cracking under the pressure for a while now. And what we're seeing today is a massive, fundamental shift. A great recalibration. So let's get into it. All right, here's our game plan. We're going to start by looking at how things used to work, the world and a product. Then we'll see what happened when the chain broke. We'll dig into the hidden human cost that was always there but often ignored. And then we'll talk about the new, more resilient future being built. And finally, what all this means for the future of making things. Okay, part one, the world in a product. Let's talk about the illusion of the seamless supply chain. So for decades, the global economy pretty much ran on this one big idea: make things wherever it's cheapest. This was the golden age of offshoring. Companies packed up their manufacturing and moved it overseas to cut down on labor costs and just be as efficient as possible. It was this incredibly complex global dance, right? Parts would show up at the factory just in time to be put together. That meant companies didn't have to keep huge, expensive inventories. And for us, it meant lower prices. On the surface, it looked perfect, a masterpiece of global logistics. But, and this is a big but, it was all built on a surprisingly fragile foundation. And that brings us to our next section, when the chain breaks. Because that fragile foundation, it was about to be exposed by a series of global shocks that didn't just crack the system, they absolutely shattered it. It really started hitting hard in 2020. The pandemic basically slammed the brakes on global shipping. Factories shut down, containers were stuck in ports, and suddenly shelves were empty. Then, on top of that, you've got major economic shifts, like the threat of huge new tariffs. We're talking up to 34% on imports, which suddenly makes that cheap part from overseas not so cheap. And now, with all the geopolitical instability and trade disputes, a system that was once predictable is just in a constant state of chaos. And to put it mildly, this was a big deal. As one chief global market strategist, Stephen Innes, said, this wasn't just some aggressive rollout. It was a full-throttle macro disruption. I mean, that says it all, right? The whole illusion of this perfectly smooth, efficient global machine, it just vanished. The system had no choice but to change. But here's the thing. These disruptions, they didn't just reveal economic problems. They forced everyone to look inside what was basically a black box, the supply chain. And what we started to find inside, well, it was a pretty significant hidden human cost. And this leads us to a really key idea: due diligence. It's this concept that says it's no longer okay for a company to just say, hey, we didn't know what was happening 5 steps down our supply chain. Nope. Due diligence means they have a responsibility to find out. They have to actively look for, prevent, and fix any negative human rights or environmental issues in their entire operation, from the mine to the showroom floor. So let's make this concrete. Let's trace a single car part. It might start in a mine, in this case, a mine in the Uyghur region run by the Xinjiang Non-Ferrous Metal Industry Group. The raw materials then go to a smelter, Xinjiang Zhonghua, which happens to be the world's biggest producer of high-purity aluminum. From there, it goes to a component maker, like Minth Group, a company that supplies parts to pretty much every major car manufacturer. And boom, that component gets installed in cars made by huge brands like BMW, Volkswagen, and Mercedes-Benz. You see how a problem that starts way, way down the chain can suddenly be sitting in your driveway? It becomes everyone's problem fast. And you know, this isn't just a story about old-school manufacturing. The massive push for green energy is creating its own set of challenges. Think about it. All those electric cars and batteries need a ton of minerals like lithium and cobalt. This huge demand is putting incredible strain on the environment and on the people who live where these minerals are mined. So, in a way, we're creating a whole new set of ethical puzzles we have to solve. So, okay, the old system is clearly broken. What's taking its place? Well, the answer seems to be a new approach built on 3 key pillars, all aimed at creating a more resilient future. The focus is completely shifting. I mean, cost is always going to matter. That's just business. But the new bottom line is more of a balancing act. You've got resiliency, just being able to handle the next crisis. But you also have 2 other huge factors that used to be an afterthought: transparency, and responsibility. And this gets us to that first pillar, building resilience. The old way, offshoring, was super vulnerable to all those global disruptions we talked about. Long shipping times, crazy costs, you name it. The new strategy, it's called reshoring, basically bringing manufacturing back home. When you do that, you get a localized, more stable supply chain, shorter lead times, and you're not as exposed to things like tariffs and international disputes.
And just to be clear, this is not some small niche trend. The scale of this shift is, well, it's huge. Just look at the numbers. In 2024 alone, we're talking about 2 million reshore jobs announced in the US. 2 million. That's a massive change.
Okay, but wait a second. Didn't we move manufacturing overseas in the first place because of high labor costs? So how does that work? Well, this is where technology becomes a total game changer. We're talking about things like automated storage and retrieval systems, or ASRS. Look at what they do. High labor costs? Well, automation can cut your workforce needs by up to 2/3. Don't have enough space? These systems can save up to 85% of your floor space. Can't find enough skilled workers? Automation handles all the repetitive stuff. This is the key. Automation is what makes reshoring not just a nice idea, but actually profitable. All right, that brings us to pillar number 2, radical transparency. Because these days, it's not enough to just say you're being responsible. You have to prove it. This framework here shows how that's done. It's all about building credibility with a system of evaluation and verification. It's basically a roadmap for companies to prove their claims and build actual trust, with customers, with investors, with everybody. And the process itself is pretty straightforward when you break it down. First, you do a baseline assessment. You just collect data to figure out where your risks are. Step 2, you set up a monitoring system to keep track of how you're doing. Step 3 is key, assessment and verification. This is where you bring in credible outsiders to check your work and make sure your findings are legit. And finally, accountable learning. You report what you found and you actually use the feedback to improve. It's not a one and done thing. It's a constant cycle of getting better. And that leads right into our third and final pillar, mandated responsibility. Because this whole push for transparency, it's not just companies deciding to be nice. It's becoming law. You're seeing a global trend here. The UK has its Modern Slavery Act. France has its Duty of Vigilance law. Germany, the US, and the big one, the European Union's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CS3D. All these laws are sending the exact same message. You can't just look the other way anymore. Ignorance is no longer a legal defense. So let's pull all this together. What's the future of making things look like? Well, it all comes down to a new bottom line. Here's the takeaway. The supply chain is no longer just about finding the lowest cost. That was the old game. The new game is about balancing 3 things. Cost, for sure, but also resilience and responsibility. For decades, the only question was, how cheap can we make this? That question has been replaced by a much more complicated and, frankly, a much more meaningful one. The future is all about finding that balance. And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. The old system, the one that was totally obsessed with cost, it hid the true price of our products, the human cost, the environmental cost. As we build this more transparent world, those hidden costs are coming out into the open, and that might mean things get a little more expensive. So the question for all of us is a more transparent world actually worth the price?